Ela chegará ao aeroporto às 15 horas.
She will arrive at the airport at 3 p.m. She will arrive at the airport at 3 p.m.
Chegamos cedo para conseguir bons lugares no show.
We arrived early to get good seats at the concert. We arrived early to get good seats at the concert.
O pacote finalmente chegou depois de 2 semanas.
The package finally arrived after 2 weeks. The package finally arrived after 2 weeks.
Eles chegaram bem a tempo para a reunião.
They arrived just in time for the meeting. They arrived just in time for the meeting.
Ele chegou em casa tarde ontem à noite.
He arrived home late last night. He arrived home late last night.
Chegarei ao escritório às 9 horas da manhã.
I will arrive at the office by 9 a.m. tomorrow. I will arrive at the office by 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Eles chegaram ao restaurante antes de nós.
They arrived at the restaurant before us. They arrived at the restaurant before us.
O trem acabou de chegar na estação.
The train has just arrived at the station. The train has just arrived at the station.
Ele chegará no próximo voo.
He will arrive on the next flight. He will arrive on the next flight.
Chegamos ao hotel por volta do meio-dia.
We arrived at the hotel around noon. We arrived at the hotel around noon.
Ela chegou um pouco cedo demais para o evento.
She arrived a little too early for the event. She arrived a little too early for the event.
Ele já chegou ao seu destino.
He has already arrived at his destination. He has already arrived at his destination.
A carta deve chegar pelo correio amanhã.
The letter should arrive in the mail tomorrow. The letter should arrive in the mail tomorrow.
Não cheguei a tempo para a entrevista.
I didn't arrive on time for the interview. I didn't arrive on time for the interview.
Eles chegaram em Paris ontem à tarde.
They arrived in Paris yesterday afternoon. They arrived in Paris yesterday afternoon.
Cheguei à festa quando ela estava quase acabando.
I arrived at the party when it was almost over. I arrived at the party when it was almost over.
Ele chegará na semana que vem para suas férias.
He will arrive next week for his vacation. He will arrive next week for his vacation.
Os convidados começaram a chegar para o casamento.
The guests have started to arrive for the wedding. The guests have started to arrive for the wedding.
Ela chegou em Nova York na semana passada.
She arrived in New York last week. She arrived in New York last week.
Eles chegaram ao museu depois que ele fechou.
They arrived at the museum after it closed. They arrived at the museum after it closed.
Desculpe pelo atraso, acabei de chegar.
I'm sorry I'm late. I just arrived. I'm sorry I'm late. I just arrived.
O trem deve chegar às 18h30.
The train is expected to arrive at 6:30. The train is expected to arrive at 6:30.
Ela chegou com um sorriso no rosto.
She arrived with a smile on her face. She arrived with a smile on her face.
Chegamos à praia pouco antes do pôr do sol.
We arrived at the beach just before sunset. We arrived at the beach just before sunset.
O time chegou cedo ao estádio para o treino.
The team arrived at the stadium early for practice. The team arrived at the stadium early for practice.
O pacote deve chegar até sexta-feira, no máximo.
The package should arrive by Friday at the latest. The package should arrive by Friday at the latest.
Ele chegou ao aeroporto e passou rapidamente pela segurança.
He arrived at the airport and quickly passed through security. He arrived at the airport and quickly passed through security.
Cheguei ao escritório e vi muitos e-mails, me esperando.
I arrived at the office and saw a lot of emails waiting for me. I arrived at the office and saw a lot of emails waiting for me.
Chegamos atrasados por causa do trânsito pesado.
We arrived late because of the heavy traffic. We arrived late because of the heavy traffic.
Eles chegaram ao restaurante sem reserva.
They arrived at the restaurant without a reservation. They arrived at the restaurant without a reservation.
O voo chegará em 10 minutos.
The flight will arrive in 10 minutes. The flight will arrive in 10 minutes.
Chegamos ao hotel depois de uma longa viagem.
We arrived at the hotel after a long drive. We arrived at the hotel after a long drive.
Ela chegou à cidade bem a tempo para o festival.
She arrived in the city just in time for the festival. She arrived in the city just in time for the festival.
Os convidados chegaram um por um para o jantar.
The guests arrived one by one for the dinner party. The guests arrived one by one for the dinner party.
Cheguei ao ponto de ônibus bem quando o ônibus saiu.
I arrived at the bus stop right when the bus left. I arrived at the bus stop right when the bus left.
Chegamos cedo ao parque para encontrar um bom lugar.
We arrived at the park early to find a good spot. We arrived at the park early to find a good spot.
A entrega chegou antes do esperado.
The delivery arrived sooner than expected. The delivery arrived sooner than expected.
Ele chegou ao show pouco antes de sua banda favorita começar a tocar.
He arrived at the concert just before his favorite band started playing. He arrived at the concert just before his favorite band started playing.
O táxi chegou em 5 minutos.
The taxi arrived in 5 minutes. The taxi arrived in 5 minutes.
Ela chegou ao escritório antes de todo mundo.
She arrived at the office before anyone else. She arrived at the office before anyone else.
Eles chegaram ao restaurante depois do horário de pico.
They arrived at the restaurant after the rush hour. They arrived at the restaurant after the rush hour.
Ele chegou ao aeroporto 1 hora mais cedo, para evitar atrasos.
He arrived at the airport an hour early to avoid any delays. He arrived at the airport an hour early to avoid any delays.
Os alunos chegaram à escola com bastante tempo antes do início das aulas.
The students arrived at school with plenty of time before class started. The students arrived at school with plenty of time before class started.
Chegamos ao local e vimos as decorações sendo montadas.
We arrived at the venue and saw the decorations being set up. We arrived at the venue and saw the decorations being set up.
A notícia chegou tarde demais para fazer algo a respeito.
The news arrived too late to do anything about it. The news arrived too late to do anything about it.
Ela chegou à reunião totalmente preparada.
She arrived at the meeting fully prepared. She arrived at the meeting fully prepared.
Chegamos ao destino e fizemos o check-in no hotel.
We arrived at the destination and checked into our hotel. We arrived at the destination and checked into our hotel.
A entrega chegou no horário, apesar da tempestade.
The delivery arrived on time despite the storm. The delivery arrived on time despite the storm.
O trem chegará à plataforma 5.
The train will arrive at platform 5. The train will arrive at platform 5.
Eles chegaram à estação assim que o ônibus partiu.
They arrived at the station just as the bus pulled away. They arrived at the station just as the bus pulled away.
Cheguei à festa elegantemente atrasado.
I arrived at the party fashionably late. I arrived at the party fashionably late.
A polícia chegou ao local do acidente rapidamente.
The police arrived at the scene of the accident quickly. The police arrived at the scene of the accident quickly.
Ela chegou ao casamento com um lindo vestido.
She arrived at the wedding in a beautiful dress. She arrived at the wedding in a beautiful dress.
Chegamos ao acampamento assim que o sol estava se pondo.
We arrived at the campsite just as the sun was setting. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun was setting.
Ele chegou ao parque com os amigos.
He arrived at the park with his friends. He arrived at the park with his friends.
O novo gerente chegará na próxima segunda-feira.
The new manager will arrive next Monday. The new manager will arrive next Monday.
Chegamos ao teatro assim que as luzes diminuíram.
We arrived at the theater just as the lights dimmed. We arrived at the theater just as the lights dimmed.
Os convidados chegaram cedo para não perder nada.
The guests arrived early to avoid missing anything. The guests arrived early to avoid missing anything.
Cheguei à reunião um pouco nervoso.
I arrived at the meeting a bit flustered. I arrived at the meeting a bit flustered.
Eles chegaram ao lago e foram direto para o barco.
They arrived at the lake and went straight to the boat. They arrived at the lake and went straight to the boat.
O trem chegou atrasado, então tivemos que esperar 1 hora.
The train arrived late, so we had to wait for an hour. The train arrived late, so we had to wait for an hour.
Chegamos à padaria e a encontramos fechada para o dia.
We arrived at the bakery to find it closed for the day. We arrived at the bakery to find it closed for the day.
Ele chegou ao escritório pouco antes do prazo.
He arrived at the office just before the deadline. He arrived at the office just before the deadline.
Cheguei à conferência e recebi meu crachá.
I arrived at the conference and received my name tag. I arrived at the conference and received my name tag.
Eles chegaram à festa com um presente na mão.
They arrived at the party with a gift in hand. They arrived at the party with a gift in hand.
Ela chegou à estação e imediatamente comprou um ingresso.
She arrived at the station and immediately bought a ticket. She arrived at the station and immediately bought a ticket.
Chegamos ao local sem problemas.
We arrived at the location without any problems. We arrived at the location without any problems.
Os convidados começaram a chegar logo após o envio do convite.
The guests began to arrive right after the invitation went out. The guests began to arrive right after the invitation went out.
Ele chegou ao cume após uma longa caminhada.
He arrived at the summit after a long hike. He arrived at the summit after a long hike.
Ela chegou à loja no momento em que estavam fechando.
She arrived at the shop just as they were closing. She arrived at the shop just as they were closing.
Eles chegaram em casa após um longo dia de passeios turísticos.
They arrived home after a long day of sightseeing. They arrived home after a long day of sightseeing.
Cheguei cedo para garantir um bom lugar para o evento.
I arrived early to secure a good seat for the event. I arrived early to secure a good seat for the event.
O ônibus chegou alguns minutos antes do previsto.
The bus arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule. The bus arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule.
Ela chegou com um grande sorriso e muita energia.
She arrived with a big smile and a lot of energy. She arrived with a big smile and a lot of energy.
Chegamos ao escritório e começamos a trabalhar imediatamente.
We arrived at the office and started working immediately. We arrived at the office and started working immediately.
Eles chegaram ao país há alguns dias.
They arrived in the country a few days ago. They arrived in the country a few days ago.
Ele chegou a Londres na semana passada para sua viagem de negócios.
He arrived in London last week for his business trip. He arrived in London last week for his business trip.
A chuva chegou logo depois que saímos de casa.
The rain arrived just after we left the house. The rain arrived just after we left the house.
Cheguei ao aeroporto e fui direto para a esteira de bagagens.
I arrived at the airport and went straight to the baggage claim. I arrived at the airport and went straight to the baggage claim.
Eles chegaram ao evento e se sentaram.
They arrived at the event and took their seats. They arrived at the event and took their seats.
Ela chegou à recepção para fazer o check-in.
She arrived at the front desk to check in. She arrived at the front desk to check in.
Chegamos cedo para evitar a multidão.
We arrived early to avoid the crowd. We arrived early to avoid the crowd.
O táxi chegou bem na hora para nos levar à estação.
The taxi arrived right on time to take us to the station. The taxi arrived right on time to take us to the station.
Os convidados chegaram à festa e se cumprimentaram.
The guests arrived at the party and greeted each other. The guests arrived at the party and greeted each other.
Ele chegou primeiro ao restaurante e fez uma reserva.
He arrived at the restaurant first and made a reservation. He arrived at the restaurant first and made a reservation.
A notícia chegou tão rápido que todos ficaram chocados.
The news arrived so quickly that everyone was shocked. The news arrived so quickly that everyone was shocked.
Cheguei ao hotel e notei uma bela vista do oceano.
I arrived at the hotel and noticed a beautiful view of the ocean. I arrived at the hotel and noticed a beautiful view of the ocean.
Eles chegaram à conclusão depois de discutir por horas.
They arrived at the conclusion after discussing it for hours. They arrived at the conclusion after discussing it for hours.
Ela chegou ao hospital para sua consulta.
She arrived at the hospital for her appointment. She arrived at the hospital for her appointment.
Chegamos ao local assim que as portas se abriram.
We arrived at the venue just as the doors opened. We arrived at the venue just as the doors opened.
Ele chegou ao encontro com uma grande surpresa.
He arrived at the gathering with a big surprise. He arrived at the gathering with a big surprise.
Eles chegaram ao cinema antes do filme começar.
They arrived at the cinema before the movie started. They arrived at the cinema before the movie started.
Cheguei à loja e notei que já estava fechada.
I arrived at the shop and noticed it was already closed. I arrived at the shop and noticed it was already closed.
A equipe chegou cedo para se preparar para o show.
The crew arrived early to set up for the concert. The crew arrived early to set up for the concert.
Ela chegou cedo ao escritório para se preparar para a apresentação.
She arrived at the office early to prepare for the presentation. She arrived at the office early to prepare for the presentation.
Chegamos à cidade depois de uma longa e cansativa viagem.
We arrived at the town after a long and tiring journey. We arrived at the town after a long and tiring journey.
O tempo chegou com uma tempestade repentina.
The weather arrived with a sudden storm. The weather arrived with a sudden storm.
Eles chegaram ao parque e imediatamente começaram a tocar.
They arrived at the park and immediately started playing. They arrived at the park and immediately started playing.
Ele chegou atrasado para a reunião e perdeu a discussão importante.
He arrived late to the meeting and missed the important discussion. He arrived late to the meeting and missed the important discussion.
Cheguei à estação de trem bem a tempo de pegar o último trem.
I arrived at the train station just in time to catch the last train. I arrived at the train station just in time to catch the last train.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes to keep improving your English. And remember, listening, practice, and improve.